The subject I have will deal with a particular problem. I will speak of a possible solution, and I will also try to link it to the crisis of the present times. I'll speak for about 40 minutes. The problem is that India is not following the trajectory of modern nations that have succeeded in taking themselves and their populations out of poverty. If you look at the nations in our part of the world, we would compare India with China, with Japan, and with South Korea. So in 1960, this is when the World Bank begins to document per capita GDP in US dollars, and all the data that the World Bank has begins from 1960. India and China were at the same level in 1960. India at $82 per person and China at 89. South Korea was twice the size. It was $158. Today, India is at about $2,200 per person per year. China is at 12,500, so it is about five and a half times in front of us. Korea is at 31,000, so it's about 15 times ahead of us. So what a country that was twice as wealthy as our country was in 1960 is today 15 times ahead. Japan is today 20 times ahead of India. The question is that, have we done something different that could have changed this? And I'm not talking of merely the present time, I'm asking this question of myself from 1960. That from 1960, it's been 60 years, more than 60 years. Could we have done something different that would have made us a China, made us a Japan, made us a South Korea? And to answer that, I think we need to look at another set of countries. That in 1960, the countries, it did not exist then as Bangladesh, but Bangladesh and Pakistan in 1960 are at the same level that we are. So we are at 89 roughly, Pakistan, Bangladesh also in the same. Today, Bangladesh is slightly ahead of India. And this happened in 2018, that they went past India. And it happened over a period where they were able to do some specific things that I will talk about. But before we compare ourselves to the US, to China, to South Korea and Japan, we should consider looking at the fact that we are actually sisters with Bangladesh and Pakistan, that we're not very different. And if you look at the bottom of the world in terms of per capita GDP, you would find that it is brought up by Sub-Saharan Africa, which is at about $1,500, Pakistan, which is also roughly the same, India, which is at $2,250, and Bangladesh, which is slightly more than us. The other thing is that if we go back to what I had said earlier, what could we have done differently? So if you look at the periods from 1960 onwards, between 1960 and 1970, GDP growth rate is 4% on an average. In the next 10 years, 3%. There's a war. In the next 10 years, 5%. In the next 10 years, 5%. In the next 10 years, this is between 2000 and 2010, it's 6%, which is the highest we've had. And in the last 10 years, it's been 5% again. So it doesn't really seem to make that much of a difference whether this country is run under what is called Nehruvian socialism, or you have what is called a command economy where the banks are taken over, or you have liberalization, or you have what we have today, which is a monopolization or a duopolization of a couple of companies that run most of the core sector industries. The growth rate doesn't seem to change. Whereas in Japan, in South Korea, and in China, and in the Soviet Union actually, also before them in the 50s and 60s, you had years, sometimes a full decade of more than 10% growth. We have never had that. So clearly there is something we are not doing or not doing right, which takes us into the same sphere as these successful countries. And there is something that we are doing which is similar to what Pakistan and Bangladesh are doing. The problem is that we do not acknowledge that we belong in this space. We want to think of ourselves as being a great power, which is a good thing. We should be aspiring to something larger than what we are. But the data seems to tell us that this is not what we are, this is not who we are, this is not what we are doing, and this is not where we are going to land up. That I think is the larger problem, that no matter who is running the country under what set of rules, it appears that we will follow the same destiny as Pakistan and Bangladesh in economic terms, and not the destiny of Japan, South Korea, and China. The other thing that is similar is what is called the Human Development Index. So one part of it, this is very dry, per capita GDP in dollar terms. But if you look at the Human Development Index, which if we take two parts to it, one is life expectancy and the other is the average years in schooling. In 1990, just at the cusp of what we call liberalization, the life expectancy in India is 58, in Pakistan 60, and in Bangladesh 56. And the average years of schooling in India 2.8, in Pakistan 2.3, Bangladesh 3.3. Today, life expectancy is the highest in Bangladesh, 72. The number of years in average schooling highest in Bangladesh, 7.4. India and Pakistan not very different in terms of life expectancy, 67 for India, 66 for Pakistan. Number of years in schooling slightly different but not by much. If you look at India's rank globally, where how we performed compared to the rest of the world, in 1990 our rank was 114, today our rank is 132. More countries have been added to the list, but the fact is that we haven't risen. We have remained where we are, and there doesn't appear to be any reason why we will break out of either the HDI index or in terms of per capita GDP and be able to become a great power, if not a superpower. This is not something that is, generally speaking, discussed when we talk about either the political economy of India or about the medium-term future of India. And I think that the narrative that is set by both government and to a large extent by media is that we are on the threshold, we are on the cusp of becoming this very big power. But the data seems to indicate that that is not true. There are certain other things that have become obvious in the last few years that we should talk about. And these are linked to why it is that India will likely remain in this space for our lifetime at least. The first is that the labor force participation rate, the number of people who are over 15, who are either working or are looking for work, is in India the lowest in South Asia. It's the same as Yemen. So in the US, the number of people who are working or looking for work over the age of 15 is 62%. In China and Vietnam, it's roughly 75%. In India, it's 40%. So the problem is that what is called a demographic dividend, when you have more people in the population that are of working age and are able to contribute to the economy, has happened in India. We went into that phase in 2019, 4 years ago. But in that same period, the number of people with jobs or the number of people looking for jobs has come down. And there are two sets of data which tell us this. Both of them are more or less in agreement. One is the government's finding, which is the PLFS, and the other is from a company called CMI. One reason why the labor force participation is very low is the low participation of women. That is true. That by some indicators, only 10% of India's women over 15 are either working or looking for work, which is probably the lowest of any recorded democracy. But there is another problem that even amongst males, the number of people who are working or looking for work or are in jobs that are satisfying is so low so as to suggest that we will not only squander the demographic dividend, but in the years to come, this number is likely to get worse. One indicator again comes from the government, which says that for the first time since 1960, findings in 2021 and 2022 reveal that more people have come into working in agriculture out of services and out of manufacturing. This is for the first time. That for the first time in 1 year, you had more people working on the farm than in the years before. Another indication is that though we can't tell this from the budget in the last 2 years, the demand for Manrega has been higher than it has ever been. That what was capped at about 60,000 crore in 2014 went to about twice that and has remained that as high as that. And though it's of course demand based, so we don't know what the exact number is in the budget itself. The fact suggests and the number suggests that high distress in the rural areas, particularly post 2016, has meant that people are more dependent on what it is that the government can give them. There are two other sets of data, both of which come from the government, which tell us that this narrative is roughly true. The first is the RBI has a consumer confidence survey. So once every 2 months, the RBI sends people to 19 cities where they ask them a series of questions, but one question is important. They ask them, are you better off economically today than you were 1 year ago? And since January 2016, for 7 consecutive years, except for one phase, which is March, April 2019, the majority of people have said no. The majority of the people since 2016 have said that we are not better off than we were 1 year ago. And this has remained consistent and is generally reported, but only by the business papers. The second one is from a survey that was reported, but like Sainath's survey, it wasn't released. It was the consumer expenditure survey of which gave data up to 2018-19. It said that the majority of Indians were spending less, including on food, in inflation-adjusted terms over 2012. So in 6 years, they had become poorer. The government dismissed the findings of its own survey and did not release it, though 2 days ago, the Maharashtra government released its component of that same survey, the state part, which said that this was factually true, that the majority of people in Maharashtra were spending less and earning less and spending less, including on food, in 2018-19 over 2012. This is before the pandemic, of course. Another survey which was first discredited by Niti Aayog, another government survey, and then released without any change, was on jobs. So just before the 2019 elections, a newspaper reported that India's unemployment rate, which had historically been about 3%, so since data began to be compiled in 1971, it had never been more than 3, 3.5, and so on. So this government survey revealed that for the first time it was over 6%. And government data since then, since 2019, has told us for the last 5 years that it has remained over 7% for the most part. This agrees with the CMI data that says the same thing. So you've got a very low labor participation. Many people have given up looking for work because it's very hard. Perhaps I have a degree, I can't find a job that I think should be of my stature, and so I stay at home. Or I'm looking for work, but I can't get a job, and which reflects in a rate of 6% plus, which it has been for the last 5 years. Now, what does that have to do with Akhand Bharat? I think that to my mind, that is something that we need to consider. One aspect of our poverty is that it comes from a particular mindset that in South Asia we have developed nationalisms that are very fierce but essentially inward focused. I will take a look at Pakistan as well. But in India, the belief is that the primary threat to India is from Pakistan. And till 2020, till the end of 2020, the Indian Army has 38 divisions, one division being about 30,000 soldiers or so. Of these 38, 25 were facing Pakistan, 12 were facing China. So the belief, the mindset is that the primary threat to us comes from the West and not from the East. It changed slightly after Galwan. So after Galwan, there was some change. We were not told what this change is because this government is fairly opaque in the way that it works. But and now 16 divisions face China, but still, even today, more divisions, more of the army is focused on Pakistan. With that, the army's core is about not defensive military practice, but about what is called a counterinsurgency. That the Indian army basically occupies itself fighting its own people, whether in Kashmir or the Northeast. And that's what it has done for several decades. Why is that the case? And I think here the Akhand Bharat thing comes into prominence. That this is not just something that the Hindutva forces or the Sangh feels. Congress also felt it and perhaps still feels it. That the idea of government in India is a highly centralized, Delhi-based, top-down form of government that is the only way to control the subcontinent. There was an option in 47 and before that for the subcontinent to be slightly different. It's called the Cabinet Mission Plan, where it was suggested that India have a more decentralized form of government, that you have a union, not as strong as the union you have now, and you have more power to different parts of the country, to different parts of the subcontinent. That, for instance, the south in India would be slightly more able to govern itself than it is today. That parts of Pakistan, whether internal to it, which is the whole of those 4 provinces, or within it, meaning the relationship that, say, Balochistan has with Punjab, which is as fraught as some of the relationships that we have in India, that would have been more relaxed. Obviously, you would have had parts of India where, like Kashmir and the Northeast, where you would have a degree of more autonomy than we have today. But I don't think that on 14th August 1947, what Nehru inherited, which is sort of essentially a aggressively expansionist imperial state, that is not the experience that we had the next day. We felt that this is a country that existed, that has been reborn, and doesn't need to be re-looked at or imagined in any other way than it is. If we were to relook at it from that lens, how different would it appear to us? If we were to look at a subcontinent, not just India, but all of it, all of what used to be undivided India. One thing is that we would definitely benefit in some way on the economic side. Why do I say that? The World Bank says that regional trade within the Indian subcontinent is 5% of total trade. In Europe, it's 68%. So it's 12 times less in South Asia. We trade less with Bangladesh and Pakistan than the European nations trade with themselves. One reason could be that a lot of import into India and Pakistan and Bangladesh is energy, oil and so on. But that is true also of Europe. They are also dependent as we are. Having taken away that component, what is it that they trade amongst themselves that make them wealthier, that make them dependent on one another, that we don't have? Pakistan has to import cars from Japan, whereas they could be just sent across the border from Punjab. But we don't want to trade with Pakistan, a market of more than 200 million people. India gets fewer foreign tourists than Thailand. Thailand gets twice as many. India gets fewer foreign tourists than the city of Paris, or the city of London, or the city of New York. And this is including the 40% of foreign tourists we get who are what is called the NRIs. We are able to attract very few people from the world to come and see India. Why is that? Obviously, one reason is that this is a chaotic, noisy, messy, corrupt, dirty place. That is true. But it is not as noisy, messy, corrupt and chaotic to other people from the subcontinent. If you go to Lahore or you go to Dhaka, you feel at home because it's the same culture, it's the same people. We stop ourselves from going there, we stop them from coming here because of this nationalism that we have developed that is aimed inward and aimed essentially at our own people. How is this manifesting itself? I think once you look at the problem in this frame, saying, okay, I'm not doing what China did, I'm not doing what South Korea did, I'm not doing what Japan did, I'm doing what Pakistan did, I'm doing what Bangladesh did economically. And if I were to change that, if I were to change my outlook in some way, being the largest country, that would help me in some way. It would help my trade, it would help my tourism. Let me try and work on that. If that problem were to be put on a platter and served up, would it be acceptable? The recent history of India seems to suggest not only no, that we don't want to see this as a solution, but we want to go in the opposite direction. That we want to continue with two things. One is more centralization, taking away the power of taxation from the states, and B, focusing on even more of inward-looking religion-based nationalism that used to come to us mostly through policy, but now also comes to us through law. So today, if you look at the ruling party in India, it has no Muslim MPs, whether in the Lok Sabha or the Rajya Sabha. So it has 90 MPs or more in the Rajya Sabha, 300 MPs in the Lok Sabha. That's about 400 MPs, none of whom is a Muslim. There is no Muslim cabinet minister for the first time in the history of India. There is no Muslim chief minister anywhere in India today, after the taking away of Kashmir's autonomy. The BJP has more than 1,000 MLAs across India, none of whom is a Muslim. So there is the idea that India is not a nation of communities. We have to have friction against each other for democracy to work. And in given that condition, it's extremely unlikely, and I would say impossible, that you would reach out to a Bangladesh or to Pakistan, given that you are hostile to elements of faith within your own country. This has always been the case. It has not been our history that under the Congress, if you look at the Congress before 47, of the over 1,000 members of the AICC across India, 3% were Muslim. So when the Muslim League accused the Congress of being a Hindu body, it was right that there was very little Muslim participation because it was a Hindu body. It has transferred, that Hinduness has transferred to the BJP in the last a decade, I would say, since the late 80s, early 90s. So the Congress was also not representative and didn't have the numbers of diversity. That was their policy. Now we have discrimination through law, which is new. That we did not have a government in the union before this saying that citizenship ought to be limited to people who don't come from the Islamic faith. So the CAA protest, which many people across the country joined, and which made the world pretty alarmed. I think the world was quite shocked at what we did with that law. Was something new, that we ignored what Article 14 and 15 said and carved out an exception based on faith. Muslims are the only community in India for whom divorce has been criminalized. So if I were to say, if a non-Muslim were to say to his wife, were to be accused of saying to his wife, talak, talak, talak in one sitting, they would not be divorced, obviously, it would not be a crime. If a Muslim man were to be accused of saying it to his wife, they would not be divorced. The Supreme Court has said that the triple talaq in one sitting is invalid. So it's not valid, but it would be a crime. For no other part of society has divorce, which is basically a civil wrong, been criminalized. There are laws that existed, which have been tightened, which target communities. So my state, I come from Gujarat, has an old law which requires that if a Hindu and a Muslim are either buying or renting property from one another, they have to file an affidavit with their names and their religion, and the district magistrate or the collector will determine whether the sale or the rent can go through. And in 2020, this law was tightened, and the government will determine something called improper clustering. If they feel that there are too many Muslims in this neighborhood, they will not let the sale or rent go through. In effect, a foreigner can buy and rent property in the cities of Gujarat, where a Gujarati Muslim cannot. And this is law. Has been challenged, but as has been the case with many difficult laws, not been heard to conclusion by the judiciary. Interfaith, after 2018, marriages between Hindus and Muslims have been criminalized in 8 states. The last one was Karnataka. And what this law says is that if a Hindu wants to marry a Muslim, we come from a very culturally conservative part of the world, where if a woman goes into a family, she's expected to be part of that family. And part of that family is traditions and faith and so on. So, this law, and she will have to convert, which is the way that these things work in our part. The law says that the couple has to file an application in some states 30 days before the marriage, and the government, the district magistrate or the collector will determine whether the marriage can take place. The government in some states, in some BJP states, and this is a law that came after 2018, says that the government can undo the marriage, including if the marriage has children. So the government says that the children will get some element of inheritance from what the father has, but the marriage will have to be undone. This is law in India. The last element which shows us that this has become ingrained is the behavior of the state. That India is today ruled by a party which believes that the release of rapists is beneficial in political terms because the victim was a Muslim whose daughter was murdered, but whose rapists were freed. And it believes, this was a cabinet minister, that the garlanding and the felicitation of people who have been convicted of lynching Muslims is beneficial. So with that sort of mindset, it is not possible for us to relook at either what the nature of our society is, what the nature of our government is, and if we were to find a problem in it, what is it that a possible solution could be, and if that solution could be reaching out to people in the neighborhood to try and cool down this kind of impassioned nationalism that has infected not just India but also Pakistan. So Pakistan, by law, no non-Muslim can become a president or a prime minister. In India, we don't need a law. It's impossible to imagine that a Muslim will ever become a PM here. But in Pakistan, the law says that you cannot do this. Though if you were to speak to ordinary Pakistanis, they would not know why that law actually exists. It is because, just like us, they have fallen into the trap of believing that there is something special about the cultural spaces that they occupy, and that should be the primary source of their nationalism, and that is what will bring them into modernity. Liaquat Ali Khan, when he introduces the what is called the Objectives Resolution, says that Pakistan, this is just a few years after Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and he says that science has run ahead of man, that man's spiritual nature has been left behind by modernity. It needs to be caught and pulled back so that man can progress. Science and religion and faith and spirituality can progress together, not separately. The atom bomb showed that it had progressed differently. And he said that our laws will not target non-Muslims. We will not, that the Pakistani state is not concerned with what the minorities do. It will try and make better Muslims of Muslims. And so they tried that in many ways. They tried that through enforcing fasting during Ramzan. They tried that through enforcing zakat, that banks would debit the money at the end of Ramzan. None of it worked. Then it all fell back to banning non-Muslims from becoming prime minister and a president. And we've seen the results of what that kind of state policy has achieved. But with all of that chaos, they are still not very far from where we are in economic terms. If you look at purely in terms of the success of the state, has the state been able to deliver economic growth? Has the state been able to make sure that Pakistan and India become the next China, Korea, or Japan? No. They have not done it, we have not done it. We might claim, maybe rightly, that we have slightly better laws than them. The end result is that both in terms of the numbers and in terms of impulse, what you are trying to do, we have remained in the same place. What then could be a possible solution? I think that there are three phases to it. The first one is probably the most difficult one, which is to accept that there is a problem. If my belief is that I'm doing very well, I don't need to change anything that I'm doing, and the next 25 years I'm going to be a superpower, then there is no need to either to introspect or to change. I hope I'm wrong, but I believe that we are in that space. That there is not enough pushback from society to government to say that essentially what we've been doing all these years is wrong. We need to make sure that we change track in some way and deliver something better and more hopeful for the population. So acceptance is the first. The second is you control what you can. What is possible in our hands, we can control. It is a fact that the next 30-40 years will bring many new challenges, but two of them particularly. One is that on climate change, we are vulnerable because a very large number of Indians are dependent on what happens to the monsoon, what happens to the groundwater, what happens to heat. And the second is that it is no longer possible for any country, especially the size of India and Pakistan, to go through the same development path that China, Japan and South Korea did, which is from farming you go to light manufacturing to assembly and then up the chain. That is no longer possible. And we can say that for a fact because in India itself, Make in India was launched 8 years ago. India's manufacturing share of GDP has fallen in the last 8 years. It used to be 16%, today it is 13%. And one of the reasons might be a lack of competence in government, but the other reason is that manufacturing employs far fewer people around the world. B becomes cheaper as it becomes automated. And this is a trend that we will not be able to escape. And climate change is a reality we will not be able to run away from. We will not be able to control it. Then what is in our control? In our control is at least the idea that we A, recognize the problems that we have at hand, B, do something about them. What is it that we can do? I think after killing themselves and humiliating themselves, murdering themselves for centuries, Europe decided that they would stop. Of course, they have done barbaric things around the world. But Europeans have killed more Europeans than they've killed non-Europeans. If you look at just the Second World War, close to 30 million, close to 3 crore deaths, most of them European, if we were to include Russia as being Europe. They recognized that there is a problem, that France and Germany could no longer be enemies for life, and they tried to solve it economically in some way, politically in some way. That option should be open to us. We should be reaching out to Pakistan, to Bangladesh, to make sure that we are able to give all three countries more opportunities for growth, more opportunities to decentralize. And that impulse will also result in a slightly more relaxed way in which, say, North looks at South, or Delhi looks at the rest of southern India, Kerala and so on. As I said, it's possible. I hope it happens. One reason it might happen is that I think things are reaching the point both on the side of the economy and on the side of what is unchangeable for it to be forced on us. And maybe that will happen. But it will be better for all of us, if we are able to accept it on our own and to be able to enforce the change on our own.